Welcome to Mystic Sleep Tales. Let me relax, and you rest where you are. Close your eyes, if they aren't already, and allow your whole body to relax against whatever is holding you right now. There's nowhere you need to go. There's nothing that demands your attention. The day is over, with all its questions and little demands, and you handled it well. More than well. So slowly let your shoulders drop, as if releasing something they've been carrying for too long. Allow your jaw muscles to relax, and leave your hands open, palms facing up or down, whichever feels more natural. There's nothing to hold on to, nothing to cling to, just this silence spreading outward from the center of your chest, settling into your arms, your fingers, the backs of your knees, the soles of your feet. You may notice your breathing beginning to slow, and that's perfectly normal. It knows what to do. It always has. Let it carry you, just as a river carries a leaf, effortlessly, intentionally, simply towards stillness. And as you rest, as the room around you grows dim and unhurried, I will take you somewhere. Pay attention, not somewhere that requires travel. Really, just to a street, a narrow street in a quiet district of London, in the autumn of a year belonging entirely to another century. The year doesn't matter. The month doesn't matter. What matters is the feeling of the air, cool and damp, bearing the faintest trace of wood smoke, and beneath that something else, the clean, resinous smell of freshly sawn timber. The scent emanating from a doorway situated low among a row of old brick buildings. A sign handwritten in modest capital letters on a dark oak board, somewhat faded over the years, simply reading Palfrey and Son's Shutter Repair and Restoration. The street itself isn't wide enough for a horse-drawn carriage. It's a passageway nestled between two wide avenues, paved with uneven stones and smoothed by years of footprints, the kind that would go unnoticed even if passed hundreds of times. The buildings on either side lean slightly toward each other, as old buildings sometimes do. Not a sign of decay, but rather a friendly inclination, as if they had become accustomed to each other's presence and no longer felt the need to stand apart so drastically. There are a few small, deep windows overlooking the street from the upper floors. The glass is thick and slightly greenish with age, and shutters, if any, are folded against the brick walls. A climbing plant, reddish with the season, clings to the wall above the shop. And although the street is mostly sheltered and the air inside is generally still, its leaves occasionally tremble when a light breeze blows. The shop of Palfrey and Son is not large. It occupies the ground floor of a building that might once have served as a modest dwelling, and its entrance is a single door of solid pine, the grain of which has been darkened by years of oil and handling. The door stands open at this hour, as it does most mornings when the weather permits, to let in such light as the lane provides, and to allow the passage of air, which in a workshop filled with sawdust and linseed and the warm exhalations of freshly worked wood is a welcome thing. A small brass bell hangs above the lintel, but it is not the sort of establishment that receives a great many visitors in the course of a day. Most of its custom comes by arrangement, by word of mouth, by the quiet recommendation of a builder or a housekeeper who has had occasion to call upon its services and found them satisfactory. Step inside, if you will, and let your eyes adjust to the dimness. The ceiling is low, crossed by beams of dark oak that have taken on, over the years, a patina like that of old furniture, smooth and faintly lustrous where the lamplight catches them. The walls are of bare plaster, gone the color of weak tea, and hung here and there with tools upon wooden pegs, each tool in its appointed place, each peg worn to a slight hollow by the repeated settling of the same handle, the same weight, in the same position, day after day, year after year. There is a workbench along the far wall, broad and heavy, its surface scarred with the evidence of long use, the pale crescents left by chisels, the faint grooves cut by saws drawn carelessly across it in some hurried moment, the rings where cups of tea have rested and been forgotten. Beneath the bench, arranged with the quiet orderliness that speaks of a man who knows his craft, are boxes of brass screws sorted by size, jars of iron nails with their lids loosely set, rolls of fine sandpaper, tins of beeswax, and a stone bottle of linseed oil with a cork stopper that has been stained almost black by the slow seepage of years. To one side of the bench, leaning against the wall in a neat row, stand the shutters. There are perhaps a dozen of them at present, in various states of repair, some still bearing the grime and weather stain of the houses from which they have been removed, others already cleaned and sanded and awaiting only the attention of a fresh coat of oil or a new set of hinges. They are of different sizes and styles, as one might expect from a city in which no two houses are quite alike, though all share certain common features. Most are of pine, the pale, close-grained Baltic pine that was shipped in great quantities to the timber yard along the south bank of the Thames, and from there distributed to joiners and carpenters throughout the capital. A few are of oak, heavier and darker, with a grain that resists the plane and demands a slower, more deliberate hand. One, set slightly apart from the others and resting upon a pair of trestles, is of elm, its surface mottled with the distinctive dark figuring that makes elm so handsome and so difficult to work, for the grain twists and turns upon itself in ways that can catch a blade and send it skittering if one is not attentive. The man at the bench is Mr. Palfrey himself. Not the son, for the son has long since taken a position with a building firm in Camberwell and comes only on Saturdays now, when there is heavy lifting to be done or a delivery to be made. The elder Palfrey is a man of perhaps 55, though he might be older for the kind of life he has led, a life of steady, physical work conducted largely indoors, in close air and poor light, tends to preserve certain qualities of youth while hastening others. His hands are large and capable, the knuckles thickened, the fingers permanently darkened at the tips with the residue of stains and oils that no amount of scrubbing will entirely remove. His hair, what remains of it, is the color of iron filings, cropped close to his skull in a manner that suggests practicality rather than fashion. He wears a canvas apron over a collarless shirt of faded blue cotton, the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and his trousers, of some heavy, dark cloth, are tucked into boots that have been resoled more than once. At this moment, Mr. Palfrey is occupied with a hinge. It is a butt hinge of cast iron, not large, perhaps 3 inches from knuckle to leaf, and it has been removed from one of the pine shutters that arrived earlier in the week from a house in Clerkenwell. The hinge is stiff. Its pin, which ought to move freely within the barrel, has become fixed with rust, and the leaves, when Mr. Palfrey holds them to the light of the oil lamp that burns steadily upon a shelf above the bench, show a crust of oxidation along their inner faces that will need to be cleaned away before the hinge can be reused. He turns it slowly in his fingers, examining it with the unhurried attention of a man for whom such objects are not merely functional, but familiar, almost companionable. He has handled thousands of hinges in his years at this bench. Hinges of iron and brass and steel, hinges with ball tips and steeple tips and plain squared ends, hinges that have swung open the shutters of drawing rooms and kitchens and bedchambers and nurseries, and each one, in its way, has told him something about the house from which it came, the quality of the original joinery, the care or neglect with which the woodwork has been maintained, the habits of the household. He sets the hinge down upon a square of oiled cloth and reaches for a small bottle of penetrating oil, which he keeps stoppered with a twist of rag. The oil is thin and pale, with a sharp, mineral scent that cuts through the warmer smells of the workshop. He applies it carefully, a single drop at the junction of pin and barrel, then sets the hinge aside and waits. Patience in this trade is not a virtue so much as a necessity. One does not force a seized hinge any more than one forces a plank of green timber into a frame that has been cut for season wood. One waits. One allows the oil to do its work, to creep into the spaces between the metal, to loosen what time and damp have tightened. And while one waits, there are other things to attend to. He draws toward him a shutter, one of the pine ones from Clerk, and lays it flat upon the bench. It is a solid shutter, not louved, with two raised panels set within a frame of rails and stiles, the molding around each panel cut in a simple ovalo profile that was common in houses built during the middle decades of the century. The paint, which was once white, has yellowed and cracked, and in places it is lifted away from the wood entirely, curling upward in thin, brittle flakes that crumble at a touch. Beneath the paint, the wood is sound. Mr. Palfrey runs his thumb along the edge of one panel, feeling for any softness that might indicate rot, any sponginess that would tell him the damp has found its way in and begun its slow, patient work of dissolution. But the wood is firm. It gives back a dull, reassuring solidity beneath his touch, and he nods to himself, a small, satisfied gesture, the kind of nod a man gives when a thing is as he hoped it would be. He takes up a scraper, a flat blade of steel set into a wooden handle, and begins to work the old paint from the surface of the shutter. The scraper moves in long, even strokes, following the grain, and the paint comes away in ribbons and curls that fall to the bench and the floor in a soft, continuous shower. The sound is gentle, a dry, whispering rasp, like the turning of pages in a very old book. Beneath the paint, the wood emerges, pale and clean, its grain running in fine, parallel lines from one end of the panel to the other. There is something deeply restful in the act of revealing wood that has been hidden for years beneath layers of old finish, as though one were uncovering a quiet truth that had been there all along, waiting only for the patience to find it. The wind, outside in the lane, stirs briefly. It is not a strong wind, not the kind that rattles shutters in their frames or sends leaves tumbling along the pavement in wild, skittering spirals. It is the merest suggestion of movement, a breath drawn and released by the city itself, passing along the narrow space between the buildings with a sound like a long, slow exhalation. It touches the ivy on the wall above the shop and sets the leaves to a brief, papery rustling, then moves on, and the lane is quiet again. Within the shop, Mr. Palfrey continues his scraping, his movements steady and rhythmic, the blade traveling the length of the panel and returning, traveling and returning, and the pile of old paint upon the bench grows slowly, a small drift of white and cream and the faintest yellow, like snow that has lain too long upon a city street. When the first panel is clean, he pauses. He straightens, pressing his fists into the small of his back, and looks about the shop with the vague, unfocused gaze of a man whose thoughts have wandered. The oil lamp on its shelf casts a warm circle of light that encompasses the bench and a portion of the floor, leaving the corners of the room in a soft brown shadow. The flame is steady, barely flickering, fed by a wick that Mr. Palfrey trimmed that morning with a pair of small scissors he keeps in the pocket of his apron. The smell of the oil, of colza oil, which burns more cleanly than the cheaper paraffin, mingles with the sawdust and the linseed and the faint, metallic tang of the penetrating oil he applied to the hinge, and the whole of it together creates an atmosphere that is particular to this place and no other, a scent that Mr. Palfrey could identify in utter darkness. So thoroughly has it become a part of his daily existence. He turns his attention to the hinge once more. It has been resting now for perhaps a quarter of an hour, and the oil has done some of its work. He picks it up, holds it firmly between thumb and forefinger of his left hand, and with his right, takes hold of one leaf and applies a gentle, steady pressure. There's resistance, a grinding reluctance, and then, with a faint sound that is almost musical, the pin shifts within the barrel. Not much, a fraction of an inch, perhaps, but it is movement, and movement is the beginning of freedom. He applies another drop of oil, sets the hinge down again, and returns to his scraping. The second panel of the shutter yields its paint more readily than the first. The wood beneath is slightly darker, having been less well protected by the frame from whatever small amounts of moisture found their way behind the old finish. And there's a knot, small and tight, near one corner, around which the grain swirls in a pattern that is faintly hypnotic, like the eddies one sometimes sees in a slow-moving stream. Mr. Palfrey works around it carefully, adjusting the angle of the scraper, reducing the pressure, for knots are harder than the surrounding wood, and the blade, if pressed too firmly, will skip across the surface and leave a mark. It is the kind of adjustment that is made without conscious thought, the body remembering what the mind has long since ceased to notice. The way a musician's fingers find the correct position on a string without the need to look. Outside, the morning deepens. The thin, pale light that entered through the open door at the start of the day has shifted, grown warmer by a degree or two, as the sun, hidden above the rooftops and the low, gray ceiling of cloud that hangs over the city, moves through its slow arc. The sounds of the lane are few and widely spaced. A door opens and closes somewhere further along, with the heavy, solid thud of old timber settling back into its frame. Footsteps pass, neither hurried nor slow, the measured tread of someone with a purpose but no particular urgency, and they fade and are gone. A pigeon settles on the ledge above the shop window with a soft, clucking murmur, rearranges its feathers, and is still. Mr. Palfrey finishes the second panel and moves to the frame of the shutter itself, where the paint is thicker and more stubborn, having accumulated in the grooves of the molding and in the joint where rail meets style. Here, the scraper is of less use, and he reaches instead for a narrow chisel, one of several that hang upon the wall behind him, each in its appointed place. This chisel is small, its blade no wider than a man's little finger, and its edge, which Mr. Palfrey sharpened that morning on a whetstone he keeps beneath the bench, is keen enough to pare a shaving of wood so thin that the light passes through it. He uses it now to clean the old paint from the molding, working the blade along the profile with a delicacy that belies the roughness of his hands, following every curve and hollow, lifting the paint in fine, precise strips that coil and fall away like the shavings from plane. The work is slow, and it is quiet, and it asks nothing of the mind but attention. There is no hurry. The shutters from Clerk will be ready when they are ready, and the owner of the house, a solicitor's clerk who inquired about the work some weeks ago and was told, quite honestly, that it would take as long as it took, has not pressed for a date. There are other shutters waiting, too, the oak ones from a house in Bloomsbury, which need new hinges altogether, and a pair of louved shutters, the only louved ones in the shop at present, from a villa in Highgate, whose slats have warped and will need to be steamed and reset, a job that Mr. Palfrey has been putting off, not because it is difficult, but because it requires a particular frame that his son took to Camberwell last month and has not yet returned. These things will be attended to in their time. For now, there is this shutter, this molding, this careful, patient removal of what has been layered over the years, and the quiet satisfaction of the wood appearing beneath, clean and pale and ready to receive its new coat of oil. The hinge, when he takes it up again, moves more freely. The pin slides within the barrel with only a slight stiffness, and Mr. Palfrey, holding the hinge up to the lamplight, can see that the oil has crept into the rust and begun to dissolve it, leaving a thin, dark residue along the inner surface of the barrel. He takes a piece of fine wire, bent at one end, into a small hook, and draws it through the barrel to clear the loosened rust, then wipes the hinge clean with a rag and tests it once more. The movement is smoother now. Not perfect, not yet the easy, silent swing that a well-maintained hinge ought to have, but approaching it. He applies a final drop of oil and sets the hinge upon the cloth, satisfied that by the afternoon, or perhaps the morning after, it will be ready. There is a kettle on a small iron trivet near the door, and beside it a spirit lamp whose blue flame has been burning low and steady since Mr. Palfrey lit an hour ago. The water within the kettle is warm, not quite simmering, and a thin curl of steam rises from the spout and drifts across the doorway before dissolving into the cool air of the lane. Mr. Palfrey crosses to it, takes down a brown earthenware teapot from the shelf above, and measures out a spoonful of tea from a tin caddy. The tea is of a common, serviceable sort, the kind sold loose from large chests in any grocer's shop, and its dry leaves have a dusty, faintly floral scent that is comforting in its ordinariness. He pours the water over the leaves, sets the lid upon the pot, and waits, standing in the doorway with his arms folded, looking out at the lane. The lane has not changed. It is the same as it was an hour ago, and the same as it will be an hour hence. The buildings lean, the ivy trembles. The stone pavement, damp from the night's dew, is beginning to dry at its edges where the weak sunlight, reflected from an upper window across the way, touches it briefly before moving on. A cat, thin and gray, picks its way along the base of the far wall with the careful, unhurried precision of one who knows every stone, every gap, every safe place to pause and observe. It glances toward the open door of the shop, meets Mr. Palfrey's eye without apparent interest, and continues on its way, disappearing around the corner with a flick of its tail. Mr. Palfrey pours his tea into a cup that has lost its handle and which he holds, therefore, by cupping both hands around its warm circumference. The tea is strong and dark, almost the color of the oak shutters that stand against the far wall, and he drinks it slowly, in small, measured sips, feeling the warmth of it spread through his chest and into his arms. He does not think particularly of anything, or rather, he thinks of many things, none of them with any urgency or force, small thoughts that rise and drift like the steam from the kettle, thoughts about the elm shutter on the trestles, and whether the grain will permit him to plane the surface without tearing, thoughts about the brass screws he will need to order from the ironmonger in Farringdon, thoughts about the Louvre shutters from Highgate and the missing frame, thoughts that come and go and leave no mark like ripples on still. Water. When the tea is finished, he rinses the cup with a splash of cold water from a jug beneath the bench and sets it upside down upon the shelf to dry. Then he returns to the bench, to the shutter, to the molding, to the chisel and the slow, careful work of uncovering what lies beneath. The oil lamp burns. The air in the shop is warm and close, scented with the accumulated evidence of labor. The hinge rests upon its cloth, the pin loosening by imperceptible degrees within its barrel. And outside in the lane, the wind stirs again, gently, and moves on, and all is quiet. The afternoon light, such as it is, has shifted by the time Mr. Palfrey sets down the chisel and surveys his morning's work. The shutter lies upon the bench, its frame now largely free of old paint, the moldings clean and sharp, the wood beneath revealed in all its modest dignity. It is not a remarkable piece of joinery. It was made, in all likelihood, by one of the many small workshops that supplied the building trade during the years of rapid construction in the middle of the century, when whole streets of terraced houses were erected in the space of a season and the demand for doors and shutters and sash windows outpaced the supply of skilled hands to make them. The joints are sound but not especially fine. The moldings are competent but lack the crispness one finds in the work of a truly accomplished joiner. Yet there is in it a solidity, a plain, unassuming serviceability that Mr. Palfrey respects. It has done its work for 40 years or more, opening and closing against the window frame of a house in Clerkenwell, keeping out the draught and the light and the noise of the street. And it will do its work for 40 years more if properly restored, if the wood is oiled and the hinges freed, and the whole thing fitted back into its frame with the care it deserves. He begins now to sand the surface, using a sheet of fine-grained paper wrapped around a block of cork. The sanding is gentler than the scraping, a softer sound, more like a murmur than a whisper, and the dust it produces is finer, a pale powder that settles upon the bench and upon Mr. Palfrey's arms and upon the front of his apron like a dusting of flour. He works in long, even strokes, always with the grain, feeling through the paper and the core for the slight irregularities of the surface, the places where the scraper has left a faint ridge or where the wood has been compressed by a clamp or a weight. The grain of the pine, revealed now in its full character, runs in clean, straight lines, with here and there a darker streak where the resin is gathered and a knot in the corner of the second panel, which he sands with particular care, has taken on a smooth, almost glassy quality, the rings of its growth tight and concentric, like the rings of a very small and very old tree. The sanding takes time. It is not a thing that can be hurried. Each stroke removes only a minute quantity of material, a few grains of wood, a thin smear of dust, and the accumulation of these minute removals, stroke upon stroke, is what produces the smooth, even surface that will accept the oil and hold it, that will repay the light with a gentle, satiny sheen rather than the dull, chalky blankness of unsanded wood. Mr. Palfrey does not count the strokes. He does not measure the time. He simply sands, and the rhythm of the work, the back and forth, the quiet rasp, the slow perfecting of the surface, becomes a kind of meditation, a stillness within motion, a peace that asks nothing and gives everything. The wind outside has settled. The lane is very quiet now. The kind of quiet that comes upon certain streets in certain parts of London in the hours after midday, when the morning's business has been concluded and the evening's has not yet begun, and the world seems to pause, briefly, as though gathering itself for whatever comes next. The pigeon on the ledge has gone. The cat has not returned. The doors along the lane are closed, their brass knockers dull in the gray light, and the only sounds are the distant rumble of a cart upon a broader street, and, nearer, the faint, rhythmic breathing of Mr. Palfrey at his work, and the soft, e-file sound of the sandpaper moving across the grain. When the sanding is done, Mr. Palfrey brushes the dust from the surface of a shutter with a soft cloth, then wipes it clean with a rag dampened in turpentine. The turpentine evaporates quickly, leaving the wood bare and slightly raised, the grain standing up in fine ridges that can be felt but barely seen. This is the moment before the oil, the moment when the wood is at its most vulnerable and its most receptive, open to whatever is offered, ready to absorb, to take into itself the substance that will protect it and give it life. Mr. Palfrey reaches for the stone bottle of linseed oil, draws the blackened cork, and pours a small measure into a shallow tin dish. The oil is golden, thick, and slow, and it carries with it a scent that is at once sharp and warm, the scent of flax seeds crushed and pressed, of something drawn from the earth and refined by human hands into a thing of use and beauty. He dips a clean rag into the oil and begins to apply it to the surface of the shutter, working in long, generous strokes that follow the grain. The wood darkens immediately upon contact, the pale pine deepening to a rich, honeyed gold, the grain standing out in sudden, vivid contrast, the darker streaks of resin becoming almost amber, the knot in the corner revealing itself as a small, perfect spiral of light and shadow. The oil soaks in quickly, drawn down into the fibers of the wood by the same capillary action that once drew water upward through the living tree, and the surface, which a moment ago was dry and chalky, becomes smooth and lustrous, alive with a depth and warmth that no paint could ever achieve. Mr. Palfrey applies the oil in 3 coats, allowing each to soak in for several minutes before wiping away the excess with a clean cloth and applying the next. Between coats, he sits upon his stool, which is a simple thing of 3 legs and a round seat, worn concave by years of use, and he rests his hands upon his knees and looks at the shutter, and the shutter, in its way, looks back at him, its surface gleaming softly in the lamplight, its panels smooth and full and ready. There is no conversation. There is no thought. There is only this quiet exchange between a man and the work of his hands, this moment of rest within the larger rhythm of the day, this pause that is not idleness, but a necessary part of the making, as the silence between notes is a necessary part of music. And you, resting where you are, may feel something of this same quietness settling over you. The warmth of the oil, the softness of the cloth, the steady, unhurried breathing of a man at peace with his labor. Let your own breathing matches, if you like. Let the slow rhythm of the work become the rhythm of your rest, the long strokes of the sanding, the gentle application of the oil, the pause, the waiting, the quiet accumulation of care upon a surface that will hold it for years to come. There is no need to follow the story any further tonight if you do not wish to. You may close your eyes if they are not already closed, and let the lane and the shop and the shutters and the lamplight and the scent of linseed oil fade gently into the soft, indistinct border between waking and sleep, where all things are half-remembered and nothing is urgent, and the world is very, very still. But if you are still listening, still drifting in that pleasant place between here and there, then I shall go on quietly, gently for the afternoon and Mr. Palfrey's shop is far from over, and there are things yet to be attended to, small things, calm things, things that ask nothing of you but your willingness to be carried along. Mr. Palfrey, having set the first shutter aside to let the oil cure in its own slow time, draws toward him the second of the Clerk and pair. It is the mate to the first, nearly identical in dimension and construction, though not precisely so, for in the days when these shutters were made, each was fitted to its own window reveal by hand, and no two reveals, however carefully the bricklayer may have worked, were ever quite the same width or quite the same depth. This second shutter is perhaps 1/4 of an inch narrower than the first, and its left stile is slightly thicker, as though the joiner who made it had compensated for some irregularity in the frame by adding a shaving of material to one side. These are the kinds of differences that only a man who handles shutters every day would notice, and Mr. Palfrey notices them without remarking upon them, the way one notices that the left shoe fits a fraction more snugly than the right, but does not think to mention it. He begins again with the scraper, and the sound of it, that dry, patient whisper, fills the shop once more. The paint on this shutter is in slightly better condition than its partner, which suggests that it faced a wall rather than the street, or that the window it covered was better sheltered from the weather by an overhang or a neighboring building. The flakes come away in broader sheets, and the wood beneath is paler, less stained by the slow seepage of moisture through the old finish. Mr. Palfrey works with the same steady rhythm as before, the blade traveling the length of the panel and returning, traveling and returning, and the quiet accumulation of old paint upon the bench grows into a second small drift beside the first. There is a particular quality to the light at this hour. The sun, which never truly showed itself this morning, has moved behind the buildings to the west of the lane, and the sky above the rooftops has taken on a uniform, silvery pallor, the color of old pewter, that casts no shadows and creates no contrasts, but simply fills the air with a soft, diffuse brightness that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It is the kind of light that flattens the world, that makes near things and distant things appear to occupy the same plane, and within the shop, where the oil lamp still burns upon its shelf, the two sources of illumination, the warm amber of the flame and the cool gray of the afternoon, mingle and produce a third quality, neither warm nor cool, but something in between, a light that is gentle on the eyes and kind to the surfaces it touches, revealing the texture of the wood and the grain of the plaster and the faint sheen of oil upon the tools without harshness or glare. Mr. Palfrey pauses in his scraping to examine a section of a shutter's frame where the paint has resisted the blade more stubbornly than elsewhere. He tilts the shutter on the bench, bringing it closer to the lamp, and peers at the surface with the focused, slightly narrowed gaze of a man who has learned to read with the way others read printed pages. There, beneath the white paint, is a second layer, older, of a pale green, the green that was fashionable in the drawing rooms of the 1850s and 60s, a color meant to suggest the calm of foliage, and which, in the dimness of a parlor lit by candles or a single gas jet, might indeed have produced something of that effect. Beneath the green, when he scrapes a little further, there's a third layer still, a brown, dark, and slightly reddish, almost the color of the oak shutters that stand against the far wall. 3 layers, 3 decisions made by 3 different hands in 3 different decades, each one covering what came before, each one reflecting the taste and the circumstances of its time. Mr. Palfrey does not dwell upon this. He notes it, as he notes all such things, with a brief, inward acknowledgement, and continues his work. The scraping of the frame is more demanding than the scraping of the panels, for the reasons already described, the paint having settled into the grooves of the molding and the joints of the construction with a tenacity that resists the broad blade of the scraper. Mr. Palfrey sets the scraper aside and takes up the narrow chisel once more, and the sound changes, become sharper, more precise, a series of small, controlled incisions rather than the long, sweeping rasp of the broader tool. The chisel follows the profile of the molding, its edge pressing into the concave hollow of the ovalo, lifting the paint in fine, curling strips that fall to the bench and lie there in delicate spirals, like the shavings of some pale, dry fruit. While he works, the sounds of the lane continue their sparse, unhurried accompaniment. A church bell, distant and slightly muffled by the intervening rooftops, strikes the hour. Mr. Palfrey does not count the strokes. He has no particular need to know the time, for his day is measured not by the clock, but by the work itself, by the progress of the scraper across the panel and the chisel along the molding, by the gradual freeing of the hinge and the slow darkening of the oil upon the wood. The bell falls silent, and in the silence that follows, there comes the sound of rain. Not heavy rain, not the drumming downpour that turns the gutters into streams and sends people hurrying for doorways, but a fine, light rain, barely more than a mist, that descends upon the lane with a sound like the faintest possible applause, 1,000 tiny impacts upon the stone and the brick and the leaves of the ivy, each one too small to hear alone, but together producing a soft, continuous murmur that is among the most soothing sounds the world has to offer. Mr. Palfrey glances toward the open door. The rain is not enough to warrant closing it. A few drops find their way across the threshold and darken the stone floor for an inch or two, but no more. The air that enters with the rain is fresh and cool and carries a clean, mineral scent, the smell of wet stone that mixes pleasantly with the warmer smells of the workshop. He returns to his chisel and his molding, and the rain continues, steady and gentle, and the lane outside takes on a faint, glistening quality, the stones reflecting the gray light of the sky in 1,000 small, blurred mirrors. The hinge. He has nearly forgotten the hinge, so absorbed has he been in the shutter. He sets the chisel down and crosses to the square of oiled cloth where the little iron fitting has been resting since the morning. He picks it up, holds it between his fingers, and tests it. The pin moves. It moves freely now, or very nearly so, sliding within the barrel with only the faintest suggestion of resistance, a whisper of friction that will disappear entirely once the hinge has been cleaned and oiled a final time. Mr. Palfrey nods. He takes the piece of bent wire and draws it through the barrel once more, and this time the residue that comes away is not the dark, gritty paste of active rust, but a thin, amber-colored film, the remains of the penetrating oil mixed with the last traces of oxidation. He wipes the barrel clean, inside and out, with a rag moistened in turpentine, then applies a single drop of the linseed oil, working it into the joint with his thumb. The hinge opens and closes in his hand with a smooth, silent motion, the two leaves swinging apart and together with the easy, balanced movement that is the mark of a hinge in proper working order. He sets it aside, satisfied, and takes up the second hinge from the same shutter, which has been soaking in a small dish of penetrating oil beneath the bench. This one is in worse condition than the first. The pin is not merely stiff, but entirely seized, fused to the barrel by a thick crust of rust that has built up over years of exposure to the condensation that forms on the inside of shutter frame when the warm air of a heated room meets the cold glass of a winter window. Mr. Palfrey examines it without dismay. He has seen worse. He takes a small hammer, not much larger than one might use to drive upholstery tacks, and a pin punch, a slender rod of hardened steel with a flat tip, and positions the punch against the head of the hinge pin. A single, light tap. The sound is sharp and bright in the quiet shop, a brief percussion that seems almost startling after the long, soft hours of scraping and sanding. He taps again and again, each blow measured and controlled, each one transmitting its force through the punch and into the pin without disturbing the barrel or the leaves. After half a dozen taps, he tests the pin. It has not moved. He returns it to the dish of oil and sets it beneath the bench once more. Tomorrow, perhaps, or the day after. There is no hurry. The rain has thickened slightly, and the murmur at the doorway has deepened by a degree. Mr. Palfrey, standing at the bench with his hands resting upon the edge, looks out through the open door at the lane. The light has dimmed. The gray of the sky has darkened to a deeper shade, the color of a dove's wing, and the lane, with its glistening stones and its leaning buildings and its single length of russet ivy, has taken on the quality of a scene viewed through water, all its edges softened, all its colors muted, everything held in a gentle, liquid suspension. A figure passes along the far end of the lane, visible for only a moment, a dark shape beneath an umbrella, and then is gone, and the lane is empty once more. Mr. Palfrey decides to close the door, not against the rain, which is still too light to cause any real inconvenience, but against the cooling of the air, for the afternoon has grown noticeably colder, and the shop, without a fire, relies upon its own enclosed warmth, the warmth of the lamp and the warmth of the man himself, to maintain a temperature at which the oil will cure properly and the wood will not contract. He pulls the door to with a gentle tug, and the brass bell above the lintel gives a single, muted note, and then is silent. The door settles into its frame with the snug, well-fitted sound of old joinery, the bolt finding its keep without effort, and the shop is sealed, a small, warm enclosure of lamplight and sawdust and the smell of linseed, set apart from the rain and the gray afternoon and the quiet, empty lane. In the new quietness, with the sounds of the outside world reduced to a faint, distant murmur, the noises of the workshop become more distinct. The creak of the floorboards as Mr. Palfrey shifts his weight from one foot to the other. The soft tick of the lamp as its metal fittings expand and contract with the heat of the flame. The almost inaudible sound of the linseed oil applied that morning to the first shutter, continuing its slow absorption into the fibers of the wood, a sound that is not really a sound at all, but rather a feeling, a sense of something happening at a pace too gradual for the human ear to detect, but which the hand, laid flat upon the surface, might perceive as the faintest imaginable warmth. Mr. Palfrey returns to the second shutter and to the work of cleaning its moldings. The chisel moves along the profile of the frame, following the familiar curve of the ovalo, and the old paint yields in its thin, curling strips. He works in silence, or what passes for silence in a room where a man is occupied with his hands. There is the whisper of the chisel against the wood, the occasional soft tap as he adjusts the angle of the blade, the rustle of his sleeve against the bench, and beneath these, steady and unremarked, the slow, even cadence of his breathing, which has fallen, as it always does when he is deep in his work, into a rhythm so regular that it might serve as a metronome for the most measured of compositions. The elm shutter on the trestles catches his eye as he lifts his head between strokes. It has been there for some days now, waiting, and it will wait some days more, for elm is not a wood one approaches lightly. The grain of elm, as any joiner will tell you, is a law unto itself. It does not run straight, as pine does, or follow broad, sweeping curves as oak sometimes will. It turns and doubles and knots itself in patterns that seem almost willful, as though the tree, in its lifetime, had been engaged in some private argument with the forces of growth and gravity, and had resolved the matter only by a series of compromises, each one visible in the twist and figure of the grain. To play an elm is to enter into a negotiation. One must read the surface, determine the direction in which the grain is running at each point, and adjust the angle and the depth of the cut accordingly, or risk a tear, a rough patch, a scar in the surface that no amount of sanding will entirely remove. Mr. Palfrey is equal to the task. He has worked elm before, many times, but he prefers to come to it fresh, in a morning, when his eye is sharp and his hand is steady and his patience, which is considerable at all times, is at its fullest. He turns back to the pine shutter and continues. The molding along the top rail is clear now, the profile emerging from beneath the paint with the clean, defined edges that are the sign of a good piece of work, however modest its origins. The bottom rail follows, and then the stiles, the vertical members of the frame, which are broader and flatter and yield more readily to the scraper than to the chisel. By the time he is finished, the shutter is clean, its surface is bare and ready for the sanding that will occupy the early part of tomorrow's work. He stands back, rolls his shoulders, and stretches his fingers, which have stiffened slightly around the handle of the chisel. The lamp on the shelf has burned lower. Its flame, which at the start of the day was bright and upright, has settled into a smaller, steadier glow, and the circle of light it casts has contracted, drawing the edges of the room closer, making the shop feel smaller and more intimate, a space reduced to its essentials, the bench, the tools, the shutters, and the man. Mr. Palfrey trims the wick, using the small scissors from his apron pocket, snipping the charred tip with a practiced motion that does not disturb the flame, and the light strengthens, pushing back the shadows by an inch or two, and the shop is as it was. He gathers the curls and flakes of old paint from the bench, sweeping them into his cupped hand and depositing them in a tin pail that serves as a waste bin. The bench, cleared of debris, shows its own scarred surface, the accumulated record of years of work. Each mark a sentence in a story that no one will ever read, but which is, in its way, as complete and as honest as any that was ever set down in ink. He brushes the dust from his apron, wipes his hands on the rag that hangs from his belt, and stands for a moment in the center of the shop, his arms at his sides, simply breathing. The rain has not stopped. He can hear it still, a faint, continuous presence beyond the door. And within the shop, the air has taken on that particular quality of enclosed warmth that comes when a small space is sealed against a damp evening. A warmth that is close and slightly heavy, that lies upon the skin like a blanket and makes the eyelids, even those of a man who is not especially tired, begin to droop. Mr. Palfrey is not tired exactly. He is a man accustomed to long hours at the bench, and the day's work, though steady, has not been strenuous. But there is in his body the pleasant heaviness that comes at the end of an afternoon spent in quiet, repetitive labor, a sensation not of exhaustion but of completeness, as though the body, having done what was asked of it, is content to rest, and the mind, having attended to its tasks with the concentration they required, is content to wander. He crosses to the trestles where the elm shutter rests and runs his hand along its surface. The elm is cool beneath his palm, cooler than the pine, which still carries the faint warmth of the oil he applied that morning. The surface of the elm is rough, the grain raised and irregular, the old finish, whatever it once was, long since worn away or removed by a previous attempt at restoration that was, Mr. Palfrey suspects, abandoned when the difficulty of the wood became apparent. There are marks upon it, too, not the marks of tools, but the marks of use, the scratches and scuffs and small indentations that accumulate on any piece of woodwork that has served its purpose in a living house for many years. A deeper mark, near the bottom of one panel, might have been made by the leg of a chair pushed carelessly against it, or by a child's toy, or by any of the 100 small accidents that occur in the daily commerce of a household. Mr. Palfrey traces it with his fingertip, feeling the slight depression in the grain, and wonders briefly about the room in which this shutter hung, the window it covered, the view it concealed when closed and revealed when opened, the hands that opened and closed it, morning and evening, season after season. But the wondering is idle, without urgency, and it passes, and he lifts his hand from the wood and steps away. The kettle is cold. He relights the spirit lamp beneath it with a match struck upon the iron trivet, and the small blue flame catches and steadies, and the water begins its slow progress toward warmth. While he waits, he takes from a shelf above the bench a small ledger, bound in boards of marbled paper, and opens it upon the bench. The ledger is his record of work in progress, a simple accounting of what has come into the shop, what has been done to it, and what remains to be done, written in a hand that is neat but not elegant, the hand of a man who uses a pen as a tool rather than an instrument of expression. He turns the pages until he finds the entry for the Clerk shutters and notes. In the margin, the date and a brief summary of the day's work. Scraped and cleaned, pair 1. Oiled, first coat. Hinge freed. Pair 2 scraped, frame cleaned. He does not embellish. He does not comment. The words are sufficient, a record and nothing more, and when they are written, he closes the ledger and returns it to its shelf. The kettle begins to murmur. It is not yet boiling, but the water has reached that stage of warmth where small bubbles form along the bottom and sides of the vessel and rise, trembling, to the surface where they break with a sound so faint that it is less heard than sensed, a vibration in the air that accompanies the first wisps of steam. Mr. Palfrey stands beside it, his hands in his apron pockets, and lets the sound fill the shop, for it is a companionable sound, one that belongs to the end of the working day, to the interval between labor and rest, when the tools have been set aside and the hands washed and the lamp turned down, and there is nothing to do but wait for the water to boil and the tea to brew and the evening to settle in. And perhaps you, too, are waiting. Perhaps you have been listening to the sound of the rain and the murmur of the kettle and the slow, steady breathing of Mr. Palfrey in his shop, and your own breathing has slowed to match, and your own hands have grown still, and the thoughts that occupied you when you first lay down have thinned and scattered, like clouds before a gentle wind, leaving behind them a sky that is wide and empty and very peaceful. There is nothing more that needs to happen. The shutters will be finished in their time. The hinges will be freed. The L will be planed. The oil will cure. The rain will stop, or it will continue, and either way, the lane will be there in the morning, and the shop will be there, and the bench and the tools and the lamp, and Mr. Palfrey will return to them, as he has returned to them every morning for more years than he can easily recall, and the work will go on, quiet and steady and without end. The kettle boils. Mr. Palfrey pours the water into the teapot, and the steam rises, and the scent of the tea, ordinary and comforting, fills the small, warm room. He pours a cup, wraps his hands around it, and sits upon his stool, his back against the edge of the bench, his eyes half closed. The rain falls. The lamp burns. The shutters stand in their row against the wall, waiting, patient, unhurried. The oiled surface of the first shutter gleams faintly in the lamplight, its grain deep and warm, its panels smooth, its moldings clean. The second shutter, bare and pale, lies upon the bench, ready for tomorrow's sanding. The elm shutter rests upon its trestles, its difficult grain a challenge deferred, a pleasure postponed. And the hinges, one freed and one still seized, lie upon their cloth and in their dish, the oil doing its patient, invisible work, loosening what has been tightened, easing what has been fixed, restoring by slow degrees the capacity for movement, for opening and closing, for the simple, essential function that is the purpose and the meaning of a hinge. Mr. Palfrey finishes his tea. He rinses the cup as before and sets it on the shelf. He takes a last look around the shop, the look of a man settling his accounts with the day, confirming that all is in order, that nothing has been left undone that ought to have been done, that the tools are in their places, and the wood is resting, and the fire of the spirit lamp has been extinguished, and the oil lamp, which he now turns down but does not put out entirely. For he will return in the evening to check that the first coat of oil on the shutter has not pooled or run, is burning low. And steady, he unties his apron, folds it with the careful precision of long habit, and lays it upon the bench. He rolls down his sleeves, fastens the cuffs, and takes from a hook behind the door a jacket of heavy, dark wool, the elbows patched with leather, the collar turned up against the chill. He opens the door, and the brass bell gives its single, muted note, and the sound of the rain enters the shop more fully now, a soft, continuous whisper that fills the doorway and reaches into the room and mingles with the last of the warmth. He steps out into the lane. The rain is fine and cool upon his face, and the air, after the enclosed warmth of the shop, is sharp and clean, with the mineral scent of wet stone and the faint, green freshness of the ivy. The lane is empty. The buildings lean toward one another in the dimming light, their windows dark, their doors closed. The stones of the pavement gleam with the wet, and from somewhere, not far, comes the steady drip of water from a broken gutter, a sound so regular that it might be the ticking of a very slow clock, measuring out the passage of the afternoon into evening in drops rather than seconds. Mr. Palfrey pulls the door closed behind him. The bolt finds its keep. The brass bell, muffled now by the closed door, does not sound. He turns up the collar of his jacket, tucks his chin against the rain, and walks along the lane, his boots steady upon the wet stone, his figure growing smaller and less distinct as he moves away from the shop and toward the broader street at the lane's end, where the gas lamps, just now being lit by the lamplighter on his rounds, cast their unsteady yellow glow upon the pavement and the passing carriages and the dark. Hurrying shapes of people making their way home through the rain. And the shop stands quiet behind him. The lamp burns low within, its flame a small, steady point of light visible through the thick glass of the window, a faint star in the dimness of the lane. The shutters rest. The hinges rest. The tools hang upon their pegs. The bench holds its scars, the air, still warm, still scented with linseed and sawdust and the ghost of tea, slowly cools, and the rain falls, and the evening comes on, and the lane, which has seen so many such evenings, settles into its own particular silence, the silence of a place that is not empty but waiting, holding within itself the shape and the memory of the day's small labors, keeping them safe against the morning when the door will open again and the bell will sound and the work will resume as it always does, as it always has, quietly, patiently, without fuss, without hurry, without end. And if you are still here, still resting in that gentle, drifting place where the sounds of the story have become indistinguishable from the sounds of your own settling, your own slowing, your own quiet descent towards sleep, then let this be enough for now. Let the rain be your blanket. Let the lane be your corridor, leading not outward into the noise of the world, but inward, into the deep, soft center of rest, where there is nothing to do and nowhere to be, and the only sound is the sound of your own breathing, steady and slow, like the hand of man sanding a piece of wood by lamplight, back and forth, until the surface is smooth, and the grain is clear, and the work is done, and the evening is quiet, and the rain falls, and the lamp burns, and everything is at peace. But the morning will come. It always does. And when it does, in Mr. Palfrey's lane, it arrives without ceremony, without announcement, as though it had been there all along, simply waiting for the darkness to step aside. The rain of the previous evening has stopped at some point in the small hours, and the sky, though still overcast, is lighter than it was, a pale, milky gray that holds within it the promise, not of sunshine exactly, but of a gentler, less insistent form of dimness. The stones of the lane are still damp, and the air has that particular freshness that follows rain, as though the city itself has been rinsed, its dust and its smoke and its accumulated breath washed away, however briefly, by the water. Mr. Palfrey arrives early, as is his habit. His boots are loud in the empty lane, a steady, unhurried cadence that echoes faintly between the buildings. He wears the same jacket, the same trousers. His hands are in his pockets. His breath, in the cool morning air, forms small clouds that drift before him and dissolve. He reaches the shop, takes from his waistcoat pocket a key of blackened iron, and unlocks the door. The brass bell sounds its greeting, and the smell of the shop, which has been sealed in overnight, rises to meet him, a warm, familiar exhalation of linseed and wood and the faintest trace of extinguished lamp oil. He enters, closes the door behind him, and stands for a moment in the dimness, letting his eyes adjust. The shop is as he left it. The bench, the tools, the shutters in their row. The first of the Clerk pair, oiled yesterday, stands where he placed it, and when he crosses to it and lays his hand upon its surface, the wood is dry. The oil has been absorbed entirely, drawn into the grain overnight, and the surface, though no longer wet, has a depth and a richness that was not there before, a warm, honeyed glow that seems to come from within the wood rather than from its surface. He runs his thumb across the panel, testing for any stickiness, any tackiness that would indicate the oil has not fully cured, but the wood is smooth and firm, dry to the touch, ready for its second coat. But that will come later. First, there's the sanding of the second shutter to attend to, and the elm to consider, and the seized hinge, which has been soaking all night in its dish of oil, and which Mr. Palfrey suspects may now be willing to yield. He lights the oil lamp, trims the wick, and the shop fills once more with its warm, amber light. He ties his apron, rolls his sleeves, and takes up the sheet of sandpaper and the cork block. The sanding of the second shutter proceeds, as the sanding of the first. The same long, even strokes, the same fine dust settling upon the bench and the apron and the air. The same quiet, rhythmic sound, like a murmur, like a breath, like the softest possible music played upon an instrument so delicate that only the patient ear can hear it. Mr. Palfrey works without haste, without urgency, his attention fixed upon the surface beneath his hands, feeling through the paper and the cork for the grain's direction, for the slight rises and falls of the wood, for the places where the scraper's edge has left its mark and where the sanding must be gentler, more careful, more prolonged. The panels emerge, smooth and even, the grain running clean and straight. The knot in the corner of the second panel taking on, as before, that smooth, glassy quality that makes of small imperfection a small perfection. The morning passes. The lane outside awakens by degrees, though its awakening is a quiet thing. The sounds of a city stirring muffled by the narrowness of the passage and the thickness of the walls. A door opens. Footsteps pass. The distant cry of a seller of some commodity, his words indistinct, rises and fades. These sounds enter the shop through the closed door as faint, blurred impressions, like the sounds one hears when lying at the bottom of a warm bath, present but remote, belonging to a world that is near but separate, a world that goes about its business without requiring anything of the man at the bench or the listener at rest. When the sanding is complete, Mr. Palfrey brushes the dust from the shutter, wipes it with the turpentine-dampened rag, and reaches for the linseed oil. The ritual repeats. The golden oil poured into the shallow tin, the clean rag dipped and drawn along the grain. The wood darkening, deepening, coming alive beneath the touch, the pale pine transforming into that rich, honeyed gold, the grain standing out in sudden clarity, the resin streaks turning amber, the whole surface taking on a luster that speaks of care and patience, and the slow, accumulative work of hands that know what they are doing and take pleasure in the doing of it. And now, perhaps, I ought to tell you something about the room above the shop for Mr. Palfrey between the first and second coats of oil, while the wood absorbs what has been given to it, sometimes climbs the narrow staircase at the back of the workshop and spends a quarter of an hour in the room above, which is not a living space, exactly, though it contains a chair and a small table and a window that looks out over the rooftops of the lane. It is a room of storage and of rest, a place where offcuts of timber are kept in neat bundles, where jars of screws and nails line a shelf along one wall, where rolls of sandpaper, too many to fit in the workshop below, stand upright in a wooden crate, and where Mr. Palfrey's father, the elder Palfrey, the original Palfrey of the sign above the door, once sat in that very chair, in the years before he passed the business to his son, and looked out of that very window at the same rooftops, the same chimneys, the same pale sky. Mr. Palfrey climbs the stairs now, his hand upon the rail, which is smooth and dark with the oil of decades of passing hands. The stairs creak beneath his weight, each step producing its own particular note, a low, wooden groan that is so familiar to him that he could navigate the staircase in total darkness by sound alone, knowing exactly where each tread lies and how much of his weight it will bear before it speaks. The room above is cooler than the workshop, for it has no lamp and no source of warmth, and the window, which faces east, catches only the morning light, which at this hour is already fading from the glass. He sits in the chair, which is an old kitchen chair with a rush seat, and looks out. The view is modest. Rooftops, mostly a jumble of slate and tile and the occasional patch of lead flashing, punctuated by chimneys from which, on a morning like this, thin columns of smoke rise vertically into the still air, each one dissolving into the gray sky at a height of perhaps 20 feet, as though the sky itself were absorbing them, taking into itself the evidence of 1,000 hearths and stoves and the quiet domestic fires of a city at rest. Between the rooftops and the gaps and angles where the buildings do not quite meet, there are glimpses of the lane below, of the ivy on the wall, of the damp stones, and further off, beyond the end of the lane, a sliver of the broader street, where the traffic passes, cabs and carts, and the occasional omnibus, their sounds reduced by distance and by the intervening walls to a gentle, continuous hum, like the sound of the sea heard from a great distance, a sound that is always there and yet never intrudes, that forms the background to everything but the foreground to nothing. Mr. Palfrey sits. He does not think, or rather, he thinks in the manner of a man who has spent his morning in concentrated work and whose mind, released from the demands of the chisel and the sandpaper, drifts and settles and drifts again, touching upon subjects without grasping them, passing over questions without seeking answers. He thinks of the elm shutter and the direction of its grain. He thinks of the brass screws he must order. He thinks, briefly, of his son in Camberwell, and of the missing frame, and of whether he ought to send a note or simply wait. He thinks of nothing. He sits, and the room is quiet around him, and the light from the window, pale and even, falls upon his hands, which rest upon his knees and upon the surface of the small table, which is bare save for a pencil stub and a folded newspaper several days old, which he has been meaning to read and has not. After a time, he rises, descends the stairs, and returns to the workshop. The second coat of oil upon the first shutter. The second coat upon the second. The clean rag, the golden liquid, the slow, reverent application, stroke by stroke, the wood receiving what is offered, holding it, darkening, deepening. And then the waiting, the sitting upon the stool, the hands upon the knees, the quiet contemplation of the work in progress, the sense that all is well, that the day is proceeding as it should, that the shutters are coming along, that the hinges will be freed, that the elm will be planed in its time, and that there is nothing in the world so pressing, so urgent, so demanding, that it cannot wait while a coat of linseed oil soaks into a panel of Baltic pine in a small shop in a quiet lane in A city that has all the time in the world. Thank you for resting here, for spending this time in the quietness of Mr. Palfrey's shop, among the shutters and the sawdust and the gentle, steady rhythm of a craftsman's day. If sleep has found you, then it has found you well, and there is nothing more to say. If you are still drifting, still settling, still making your way toward the deep, soft center of rest, then let the oil cure, let the hinges loosen, let the rain return or not return, and let the lane hold you gently as it holds the shop holds the shutters, as the shutters, in their patient waiting, hold the memory of every room they have ever sheltered, every window they have ever closed against the night. And should you wish to return again some evening to this lane, to this bench, to this lamplight, and this quiet, you would be most welcome. You would always be most welcome. Rest now. Rest well. And may the morning, when it comes, find you as the oil finds the wood, gently, thoroughly, and with the kind of warmth that lasts.